Do you really accomplish the impossible? God, we've been in slavery for 400 years. I don't see that part of your character. Right? And God says, you want to know who I am? Moses, you will know me as you walk with me. I am who I am, who I am, who I will be, who I will be. What do you want me to give you a book about it? You won't believe me. Moses, you'll see who I am as I bring the most powerful nation on earth to its knees through the plagues that are about to take place in the next 11 chapters of Exodus. When you see Egypt crumbled economically, politically, religiously, socially, and when you walk out with the wealth of that nation through dry ground on a riverbed and on a seabed, you'll start to understand who you're messing with. I am who I am. And what we see in the Exodus event, when God takes this nation of slaves and He brings them out of Egypt and into the Promised Land, is not just for Israel. God is not playing favorites with the nations. I guarantee you, when we get to heaven, we will see Egyptians, man. They'll have their heads shaved just like that and all the fine. Basically, everything you learned about Egypt in junior high is what it was like to live there when the Israelites left. King Tut, whose tomb was raided, and that's how we know what it was like to be an Egyptian pharaoh, he died 80 years after the Israelites left Egypt. So we have a very clear picture of Egypt at that time. And when Israel left with the wealth of Egypt, it was a statement of the power of God for the whole world. And let me tell you how I know that's true. When we get to the next part of our story, when the Israelites enter the Promised Land, the first place that the spies go, Moses sends them to this little town on the outskirts of the Promised Land called, anyone know? Jericho, right? And the spies enter Jericho. And they meet this prostitute there, Rahab. And Rahab brings them into their house. And she says, well, I'm melting in fear before you because I know you're an Israelite. And here's the catcher. I heard what your God did to Pharaoh and his armies, how he dried up the Red Sea before you. And I know that he's given you this land. And Rahab, watch, she turns her heart away from the gods of the Canaanites. And she turns it to Yahweh. And she's saved. She is rescued. The spies say to her, hang this ribbon of red thread out your window, and when we come through, we will not destroy you or your household. We will save you. That story exists to illustrate this salvation moment. Old Testament and New. When you turn to God and you say, God, I know you're real, I know you're true, and wow, I'm a prostitute. Could you possibly love me? God says, absolutely. My love for you has nothing to do with you. It never did. My love for you is a statement of my goodness, not yours. You turn your heart in faith towards me. You are as rescued as Abraham was. And so what we're seeing God doing for the Egyptians is the same thing He's doing for the Israelites. He is calling His people out of slavery in Egypt, bringing them into the Promised Land, but He's asking for their hearts to be turned towards Him. Anybody in this story, from the most hardcore Egyptian in Egypt to the most faithful Israelite walking through the Red Sea, had equal opportunity to be saved. Okay, as they turn their hearts towards God. All right, so let's look at this. The rest of this timeline here: Israel, Exodus, and the law. So we got slavery in Egypt. Okay, the Exodus event happens about 1440 BC, and that was a huge statement about who God is and what He's like. Alright? Now, think about this. That's Genesis, Exodus. Then we get to this section here, the giving of the law. Right there. And we get to the book of Leviticus, where we have the first, well, really we see it in Exodus first, chapter 24 through 21 through 24 is the first section of law. But we really see it in Leviticus. Probably what we would consider to be the most boring book in the Old Testament for a lot of us, right? Let me help you understand this. Israel has just spent 430 years living in a pagan nation that worshiped little images of golden calves. Okay? And then within a period of maybe 6 or 8 months, they saw the most powerful nation on earth completely brought to its knees. They saw a water part right in front of them, and they find themselves about 8 months later out in the middle of the desert following a pillar of fire and cloud, and every time their animals get too close to it, they get smoked, and they're asking the question, okay, who is this God? What is He like? And what does He require of us? Because Our identity as a nation is Egyptian. We've lived in Egypt our whole life. In fact, if you go back to Exodus 3, when Moses left Egypt for the first time, remember he killed this Egyptian overlord. He flees to Midian. When he goes to meet Zipporah's family at the well in Midian, what do they say about him? They say, "Oh look, an Egyptian has come." Moses wasn't an Egyptian. He was an Israelite. But he sure acted like an Egyptian. He sure looked like an Egyptian. He grew up in Pharaoh's household. Well, the Israelites had that same identity. When they left Egypt, they were Egyptian in every way. They had Egyptian worship practices, Egyptian gods, Egyptian dress, Egyptian food ritual, Egyptian dietary habits, Egyptian cleanliness, hygiene. And so what we have in the law, this book that's so boring, if you don't understand the historical context, is such an incredible gift to Israel. Because through the book of Exodus 21 through 24, and through the book of Leviticus, God is completely reshaping this nation from a pagan nation to a monotheistic nation. He's teaching a people who know nothing about Him how to walk with Him. He's making it real clear who you can and can't sleep with. I mean, you got a whole chapter in Leviticus. Don't sleep with your mom, don't sleep with your sister, don't sleep with your brother, don't sleep with your goats. And you think, is this really necessary? Yes. That's the kind of stuff that was going on in Egypt. This is what you can eat. This is what happens when you're unclean through menstruation. This is how you deal with hygiene. This is how you deal with leprosy. Right? He's taking a nation that had no structure, no governance. Here's what you do when someone murders. Here's what you do when someone steals. And He's forming them into an identity that reflects His character. That's awesome. Man, I love the book of Leviticus. But none of that stuff, and here's what I want you to understand about the law. The giving of the law was never, ever, ever about earning favor from God. It was never about getting saved. Hallelujah. In the Baptist sense, right? It was about responding to the otherness of God in a way that draws us closer to fellowship with Him. It was about simply saying, "Wow, God." Well, there's a repeated phrase in Leviticus, and it goes like this: "Be holy, for I am holy." Do you guys know what the word holy means? It means totally separate, completely other. And what God's saying through the law, in the book of Leviticus and the giving of the tabernacle and the whole thing is, you know what? I'm not like those pagan gods. I'm not like Pharaoh. I'm completely different from everything that you are and everything that you act and everything that you could become, and I want you to represent me to the nations. Not so that I'll love you, it's because I love you. I want you to conform to my image, not to earn anything from me, but to represent it to the nations. Be holy from holy is not an opportunity to earn salvation. It's an opportunity to be a witness. That's what God wanted for Israel. And in fact, if you fast forward to a part we're going to get to tomorrow, when we get to the period of the prophets, we get to my favorite prophet, Isaiah. One of the ways that Isaiah speaks of Jesus as he gives a prediction of Him 700 years later is he says, "You know what, Israel, you failed as my servant. I set you in the nations to be my servant. I put you right in the middle of this Fertile Crescent where all this major trade was taking place, from Egypt to Assyria, from Egypt to Babylon, from Egypt to Persia, from Egypt to Greece. And you were supposed to be my representative to the nations so that when the nations saw you, they say, wow, why do those people eat that way? Why do they talk that way? Why do they sleep that way? Why do they dress that way? What's different about them? It must be their God. Well, I want to know that God. That's the point of the law. And what we see Isaiah saying in 700 BC is, you know what, Israel, you failed as the servant of God. But He's going to do a grand do-over, and He's sending the servant, capital T, capital S, who's going to do it right in all the ways that you do it wrong. It wasn't an accident that Jesus spent 40 days in the desert. How many years did Israel spend there? 40. I mean, think about Jesus' story. He spends 40 days in the desert in the beginning of Matthew. And then what does He do? He goes up onto the mountain, just like Israel did in the desert. And He gives the new law. You've heard it said, but now I say. Then He comes down off the mountain and He surrounds Himself with how many disciples? It wasn't because there were only 12 who were worthy. He's reenacting Israel's story, but he's doing it without sin. He's being the suffering servant of Isaiah. All right. So Israel comes out into the wilderness, and they have this law that's given for them. One of the other things that the law does for them, and this is super, super important, is it teaches Israel, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that when there's sin, there has to be death. And I had some cool slides about this, but if you could just imagine the tabernacle or the temple, you guys have all seen this, but a major portion of the law in the Old Testament, a major portion of the book of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, is the construction, and Exodus actually, is the construction and building of this tabernacle, where God was going to dwell right in the midst of Israel, but there was going to be a separation. And one of the major functions and purposes of that tabernacle building was that every day, morning and evening, there would be blood sacrifice in that building and on that altar to send the message to Israel. You know what? Through your sin, you've separated yourself from me. And in my holiness, there has to be an atonement for your sin. So the law does two things in my mind. Number one, it sets Israel up to be a blessing to the nations. And number two, it teaches them that sin deserves death. It teaches them the consequence, the reality of sin. And that's important because one of the first things we see John the Baptist say, when Jesus shows up in the first century, he turns to his disciples right in the beginning of John's Gospel and he says, hey, see that guy over there? That's the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the whole world. And John's disciples just dropped their stuff and they're, all right, well, see you later, John. Well, why did they respond that way? Because they had this temple system where every morning they had animals, two lambs, morning and evening, sacrificed on that temple. You could see the smoke from the altar going up every single morning. And in this Levitical system that God set up, and boy, I wish we could go into more of this, but when we have the giving of the law here, every time you sinned, you had to atone for your sin. Oftentimes, through the shedding of blood. You would literally have to take an animal to the priest in front of the temple, and you'd have to put your hand on the head of that animal while the priest slit its throat. And you'd have to watch the priest shed the blood over that altar. What was that all about? Well, God's teaching the world, you know what? Your sin costs. And if you're not going to die, something else has to die in your place. He's setting the world up to understand the reality of the ministry and message of Jesus. Now, let me just tell you where the story's going. I will step on out on a theological limb, and that's okay. You know, I think there is a popular thought among my friends today that Jesus was just simply a good guy. And he came to show us some nice teachings. I disagree with this thought. Jesus came to fulfill this very promise that started all the way back in Abraham. The only reason why God can come to Abraham in chapter 12 and say, Abraham, I will part that animal and I will walk through the middle of it. The only reason God can say, Abraham, I don't care if you laugh in my face. I will never break my faithful love to you. If it kills me, I will never stop loving you no matter how you act. The only reason God can do that is because one day he did it. One day he made good on that promise. He did in fact kill himself. God killed himself to satisfy once and for all the requirements of our sin. If Jesus isn't God, and if he did not in fact die as a substitutionary death for our sin, then you'll never see me here on this Sunday morning again. I would so much rather go rock climbing. It's that important. He's not just a good guy. He really is Savior. I firmly believe that. That's why I'm not selling insurance, which is what I'll be doing if we're doing this. We're making a lot more money, too.
You'd have to sit in a cubicle.
No, I wouldn't. I'd get to drive my father-in-law's big Mercedes. Yeah. He's offered it to me several times. Bruce will take you up on that. I hope you're listening. Okay, so yeah, there you go. I'll step off my soapbox now. We got 7 minutes. Israel, Exodus, and the giving of the law. We've talked about the tabernacle, the wilderness. Let's talk about this just for 1 second. The wilderness. 40 years in the wilderness. Was that God's intention that Israel would spend 40 years in the wilderness? No. It was God's intention that Israel would spend about 12 to 14 months in the wilderness, the best I can tell. It took them about 8 months to get down to Sinai Peninsula and to set up the tabernacle, and it was only a 10-day journey from there to what's the name of the oasis halfway through, where the spies were sent out. Help me, Bible man. Where did Israel send the spies? We're going to say Kibroth Hattaavah, but I don't think that's right. Anyway, it was only 10 days to Kibroth Hattaavah, if that's where it is, and then another 3 days into the Promised Land. In other words, what I'm saying is only 13 days from Mount Sinai to Israel. And that's as long as God intended for Israel to spend in the wilderness after the whole deal with the golden calf in Exodus chapter 32. 13 days turned in to 40 years. Why? Because of that whole spy incident. Because
I thought it was to get a new generation.
Yeah, that's right.
The old generation died out, and the new generation.
That's right. So from the Sinai Peninsula and at Mount Sinai, Israel journeys to, I want to say Kibroth Hattaavah, but I can't remember. It's on my map. It's a major Sinai. It's a major Sinai oasis. And from that point, Joshua sends out spies into the Promised Land. They're gone for 40 days. And they come back and they report what they saw, and the whole nation freaks out and says, we can't go into this Promised Land. God, there's giants there. Right? And God says, who am I? I'm the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Remember, I accomplish the impossible. I do what you can't do. And they go, I don't think so. And they start this big coup, and God says, okay, that's it. You know what? I'm going to start over with a totally new generation. All of these males, 20 years old and older, who doubted me, are not going to see the Promised Land. Now, think about that for a second. As salvation, right? Salvation story, here it is. How does somebody get saved? And the author of Hebrews picks up this in Hebrews chapter 4. There's a whole chapter about it, about the rest of God. And here's what the author of Hebrews says. That Israel, it's 3 into 4. That Israel failed to enter the rest of God, the Promised Land, because of their unbelief. And the author of Hebrews says, so now at the present moment, see to it that you also do not fail to enter the rest of God because of unbelief. Well, there it is. That's the salvation story. Old Testament and New. How did someone get saved in the Old Testament? Belief. You go, well, God, that doesn't make any sense. You're going to kill those giants, and you're going to give me that land with vineyards I didn't plant and crops that I didn't harvest? That doesn't make any sense, but okay. And you get in. You enter the rest of God. Well, the same sense is true in a spiritual sense. Now, God says, hey, I want you to be in my heaven for forever. And I don't care the kind of good stuff you've done. You can't be good enough. You got to be perfect. But if you believe that I'm real and true, and you believe that I've given you my righteousness, then you'll enter my rest. And that's it. It's kind of simple, you know? I think that's one of the reasons why Jesus said, hey, unless we become like a little child, we'll never see the kingdom. It doesn't make sense, but it does make sense. It makes a whole lot of sense, but it doesn't make any sense, you know? Okay, Promised Land. We got 3 minutes. You guys get this.
Is that a promise?
What? Yeah.
Is that a promise?
That's a promise, yeah. 1400 BC. After 40 years in the wilderness, which God did not intend for Israel to spend. So I think the caveat I was trying to make there before I got sidetracked is we can derail the intentions of God for us through disobedience, can't we? I think we can all probably insert a story about that now. I have many. 1400 BC, the Israelites enter the Promised Land. I want to tell you one story about this because there's a lot of killing in this portion of the Bible, and this takes place in Joshua, Judges, and Ruth. I'll just talk about Joshua for a second. We'll come back next week and do Judges and Ruth. But Joshua, there's a cool event in Joshua 6 that goes like this, and we'll end here. Joshua, here he is the commander of this new army. Now Moses is dead, and he's got to take this nation who really aren't professional soldiers, and he's got to overrun this fortified city of Jericho. So he's out there on a scouting mission, out on the plains of Jericho, looking out over the city early in the morning. And he sees this guy coming towards him with a sword in his hand, at the end of Joshua 6. And so Joshua takes out his sword and he says, who are you, and are you for us or against us? He thinks it's someone, commander maybe from Jericho, coming out to do a truce, or maybe a spy, or maybe a deserter or something. And the guy says, neither. Think about that. One of the major questions we have with the conquest is, what is God doing with it? What is he playing favorites with the nations? Does he just take Israel and just overrun this whole nation of people and just kill them all, you know? Is God playing favorites? No, he's not. That's exactly what Joshua asks him. Are you for us or against us? And God says, neither. I'm not on your side. But as the commander of the Lord's army, I've come. And I think that's God. Because Joshua bows down and worships this guy. And every other time in the Old Testament when someone worships something that's not God, they say, whoa, don't do that. You know? But this guy takes it. He receives the worship. I think it's God showing up as a soldier. And God says to Joshua, I'm not on your side. I'm on my own side. And if you want to be saved, then there's the line. You step towards me. Right? You decide, Joshua, whom you will serve. You come to my side, there's life. You come to another side and there's death. And so we see Israel entering Jericho and wiping out that city and pursuing up the Jordan Valley and up into the hill country and up to modern day Jerusalem and going on this lightning campaign of pushing the people out of the land and wiping out every city and killing real people. And this is a part of the Old Testament that I think most modern day people have a real trouble with. And I would love to talk more about it, but I will just say this. There is an interesting passage in Genesis where God says to Abraham, when he's living in the same nation, before he ever goes to Egypt, God says to Abraham, you're going to spend 430 years in slavery in Egypt until the sinfulness of this nation and people is complete. God predicts the whole period of slavery in Egypt, and he says, you know what, Abraham? I'm going to bring you back into this place, but not until I've given this people every opportunity to right this wrong. And as you investigate what was going on in Canaan when the Israelites came in, it's not a pretty picture of humanity. And in some way, God is using Israel as an instrument of his judgment against a nation that had completely gone astray. Now, I know that doesn't make it much easier. But I do think there's a way to work through the killing that we see in Joshua and still have a God who is good. And who, in fact, means what he says. And I'll end with this when he says, you know what? If you will believe in me, there's life for you. But if you reject me, there's death. One thought for you. Most people who grow up, and I will be done in 1 minute. Most people who grow up in America would say this: yes, there's a heaven and yes, there's a hell. There's a place where people go forever and enjoy good things, and there's a place where people go forever and enjoy bad things, wherever view or hell is. Where do we get that idea? Where do we get the idea that what you do on planet Earth has measure and has meaning for eternity? We get it from the Hebrew Old Testament. We get it from these type of stories where God says, I'm not on your side, Joshua. I'm on my side. And if you come to my side today, you'll have life. You'll enter my rest and you will live. But if you don't, it's destruction for you. This is what unbelief looks like, Joshua. Destruction. How do you teach the world about that? The reality of sin and the reality of judgment. I think this is one of the ways you do it. You wipe out an entire city in front of everybody's eyes and you go, that's what rejection of Yahweh looks like. And I think what's ultimately on God's mind, and this is the last thing I'll say, is spiritual reality. And what's interesting to me is it's much more easy for our students to stomach the thought that God will in fact one day come back as we see him returning in Revelation and judge the living and the dead with a sword coming out of his mouth. I mean, that's literally how the Bible ends. It's like nobody that comes to my school has a problem with that, you know? But when God goes into Jericho and kills men and women and children, we're like, well, wait, God, why are you doing that? You know? It's like, well, which one's worse? You know what I mean? The second one. And I think one of the things God's doing is he's saying, you know what, I really do judge the world. Sin really does have consequence. And that's not a thought that any of us like to stomach, but yeah, I'll end there. So thank you guys. Sorry I went over. We're going to come back next week and we're going to do the second page. If you want to bring this first page, we can tape them together. I'll bring some tape.